Welcome back to Restore Gospel Podcast. We're friends having casual conversation about the things of eternity, and we welcome you into that conversation. Got some good things coming up today. Shane, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you take it away and jump right in. I know you got a lot to share.
All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the isolationist doctrine, and there's actually two isolationist doctrine. One is related to American history, where it's talking about us staying out of other countries' business, out of their wars and things. But what we're going to talk about today is the isolation doctrine that has to do with the fact that scientists believed for many years that there was no contact between the North American continent and Europe and Asia and Africa, and so there was sort of this wall between the two, where they just believed that there was no contact, and so the Americas were this virgin land that there was no one had crossed, there was no interaction, there was no exchange of languages or ideas or anything, and over time that has been sort of debunked and is still being debunked. And so I thought this was important because for us that believe in the Book of Mormon, it's important that we understand, obviously, if we believe in the Book of Mormon, we don't believe in the isolationist doctrine, because people did travel here. The Book of Mormon says they did. You got the Jaredites, you've got the Mulekites, you got Lehi and his family. And so, and we know there's others too that have traveled in other parts of the world, because there's other records that we're told that the house of Israel spread all throughout the whole world. And that they have kept records, and those will come forth in someday in the future. And so, in order to sort of show that the Book of Mormon is at least possible, we have to show that people did travel. And so, let me pull my thing up here if I can get it to work. There we go. So we'll talk a little bit about what this doctrine was. So basically, the early historians in the 16th and all the way up to the 18th centuries, they described Columbus as the discoverer of America. I think if I was to ask you guys who discovered America, there'd be an automatic, kind of without thinking, Columbus, right? We were all taught that in school.
What was it? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and basically, when they came, they found a native population that was, in European standards, barbaric, right? They didn't have weapons. They didn't have machinery. The weapons they had were more, bows and arrows and that kind of thing. And so they seemed sort of barbaric and just seemed like they'd never had any kind of technology or anything. And then what they've found over time is that their technology was actually quite advanced at one time, but they degraded over time, through sin, through rebellion. The Lamanites wiped out the Nephites, and they were very barbaric people, and they lost that truth that they once had. They lost the intelligence. And so anyway, so we'll go back to this belief. So the 19th century Eurocentric mindset was basically saying that Europe and Asia, that's kind of the center of the world. That was considered the old world. And then this new land of America that they're discovering for the first time, at least from their perspective, was called the New World. And so the idea was promoted by all the educational institutions especially in the 1800s. The secretary of the Smithsonian, his name was Joseph Henry. He was one of the biggest proponents of this, and the Smithsonian Institute, they kind of controlled all things archaeology. I mean, anthropology, all that stuff was kind of run through the Smithsonian. They dictated what was truth and what wasn't. And then there's also this anthropologist, Lewis Henry Morgan, that also was very famous and very supportive of this idea. And so, and what happened, what that did was, by establishing this belief, it eliminated all possibility that there could have been any kind of travel or any kind of exchange between the old world and the new world prior to Columbus. And so when things like the Book of Mormon or any other kind of archaeological things came forward, they were immediately dismissed as frauds, because they knew 100% in their mind that there'd been no contact until Columbus came along. And so it was embraced by the nationalists of America, because they wanted to be able to have a clean break from the old world. They wanted to be able to say, this is a new land, a new place where we've reinvented ourselves in the new world. And there's kind of this pride of, we discovered it. It's ours. This is who we are. Kind of ignoring the fact that there had been, indigenous populations in the millions here with cities and highways and, construction and all kinds of advanced technologies in the far past. And so it also, this doctrine also made colonialism seem like it was God's mission. God sent us here to save these poor savages. And so you have the spread of Catholicism, the spread of Christianity, which was a good thing. I'm not saying it wasn't, but it using that as the excuse of saying, oh, this was a savage, barbaric land that had never been discovered. Now is our chance to bring truth to them. And so it made it by calling it untouched and barbaric, it seemed like it was a divine mission to sort of just take over and, say that we're the first ones here. And then it became a standard narrative in school textbooks. By the late 1800s, pretty much every textbook said that the land of America had never been touched until Columbus. And so I wanted to bring a few quotes from this time period. So, John Fiske, he was a Harvard historian in 1892. He said, until Columbus crossed the Atlantic, the New World lay hidden from the Old, unknown to history, untouched by the civilizations of Europe, Asia, and Africa. This is out of a 1920s textbook primer. It says, Columbus discovered America in 1492. Before his voyage, the peoples of Europe knew nothing of the lands across the ocean, and the Indians had never seen white man. And that was probably true for that time period in the 1400s. But to say they had never seen a white man is an assumption. So I'll keep going here. And then the World's Fair exhibition in Chicago, this in 1893, it said the New World was unveiled to civilization by Columbus, who brought Europe face to face with lands and peoples unknown. The 1968 Encyclopedia Americana said, Columbus's voyage opened the New World, which until then had been isolated from civilizations of the Old World. So, this was permeating all the textbooks, all the, common thoughts. 1909, we who love America should be grateful to them all, meaning the explorers that discovered America, but especially to the one who first pointed out the way, to the bold sailor who crossed an unknown sea, the good, wise Christopher Columbus, the man who found America. It's, if you're a Native American, you're sitting there going, wait a minute, he found it. What are you talking about? We've been here, thousands of years. It's all about perspective. From a European perspective, yeah, he was the one that kind of brought it to people's attention. But to say that, it was undiscovered at that point is it's all about perspective. And, it's kind of an assumption that we have all the answers and nobody else does. And then this let me see here. So this is kind of interesting. So this last quote here let me get my pointer. Okay. This last quote here, this man who found America. I actually have that book. It's from it's my screen's flipped, but anyway.
Yeah.
It's from
okay. Go ahead.
All right. So this quote here, the man who found America in 1909. I actually have that book. This is the book. It's an actual copy from 1909, which is kind of cool. And then I also have this quote here. This is out of an elementary history book, which I actually have that too. If you want to show my screen, this is the book. This book was from 1890, and it says the world had grown old, very old, before America was discovered. Great empires had risen in Europe and Asia and passed away. Many millions of men had lived and died, but not half the earth was known. Men did not even know its shape. Most persons thought the earth was flat. And then he just keeps on talking about how we didn't know anything about the world. And that's true.
Things have circled back, right? Now you got the flat earthers again.
Exactly, yeah. But that's true that the Europeans maybe didn't know about the world, but other people did. The Chinese traveled all over the world. There's a lot of old ancient maps that show the world as, as round and show a lot of the shapes of the continents. And then obviously the Native Americans that lived here knew about it because they were here, right? So it's all about perspective. But anyway, I just thought that was really interesting, showing how, these little books that seem harmless, they're just given basic stories. The perspective that we all learned as children is, that we're kind of the center of the world, the center of all knowledge and existence. And so as time has gone on, some of this has changed. So let me show you some things here. So first of all, there's some problems with the isolationist doctrine. So and I'm going to call it the isolationist myth, but it erased the need to treat indigenous tribes with respect, because we saw that as we discovered this virgin unknown land, and these people shouldn't be here. So it's okay to run them off. It's okay to treat them badly. They're trespassers on our newly discovered land, and of course that's not their perspective. They were here first. And then, so by portraying America as untouched and virgin, it redefines conquest as discovery. So we come in and we start wars. We wipe out the indigenous population, even giving them blankets with smallpox and that kind of stuff. And we don't call that conquest. We call it discovery, because of this isolationist belief. And then the policy, it discourages honest investigation. So if we believe that no one came here prior to Columbus, then what's the point in doing research? What's the point of doing archaeological digs? What's the point in learning the languages of the natives and learning their customs and that kind of thing? It's all disregarded, because it would go against our narrative. If we happen to find something, it would go against the narrative of what we believe. And so we don't look. It's kind of a head in the sand approach to science. And that's something I've noticed over the years, is that science oftentimes is at odds with the gospel. Science is almost trying to prove God not true. I mean, you think about pure science is gathering facts and, learning about truth. That's pure science. But, our modern science really doesn't seem to be interested in truth. They're more interested in supporting the narrative that's already been pre-established. And that has led us down a lot of wrong roads, evolution being one example. I don't think you can be a hardcore evolutionists and believe what the Bible says about creation. We try to make it fit. We try to say, well, the 7 days of creation, 6 days of creation, it wasn't actual days. He was talking about, millennia or whatever, and, trying to make it all fit. But the reality of it is we have the genealogies from Adam all the way down to, to Jesus, basically, in the Bible. And so, unless these guys were living, 100,000 years, the earth is not millions and millions of years old. And that's an example where science has created a narrative that contradicts what God has already told us. And this narrative of the isolationist doctrine, it also creates a contradiction, because the scriptures tell us that Lehi came over, the brother Jared came over, Mulekites came over, etc. And so also this doctrine, all the discoveries that contradict the narrative, they automatically become fraudulent. So people are afraid to even come forward. You find something on your land, you're out digging, your farmer's out in his field, and he comes across some artifact, and he brings it forward, he'll immediately be, labeled as a con man, even though he just honestly found this thing in his field, doesn't know what it is, and so that's part of the problem too. It basically closes people's eyes, and shuts off, rational thought. And then, of course, the worst thing that it does is it eliminates the possibility of the Book of Mormon. If the isolationist doctrine is true, then the Book of Mormon did not happen. And that's, of course, for us that believe in the Book of Mormon, that's another issue. And it also shuts off the possibility that other books, other documents will come forward in the future, which we know from the Book of Mormon text that they will. And so I've got a few things in here that kind of debunk this doctrine. And so I'll just kind of go through them. So in 1000 AD, there's a Norse settlement. In the 1960s, this woman found this settlement up in Newfoundland, which is right here on the map, if you see my star there. Just north, it's in Canada, just north of Maine, northeast of Maine. And so they found this Norse settlement. It dates back to 1000 AD. They found it spans about 31 miles. They found 8 buildings. They were made of sod and they were over a wood frame. There was 800 Norse artifacts unearthed, and that included bronze bones. Bronze, and then they found different bones of human bones. They found stone artifacts. They found evidence of iron production. And now the site has actually been turned into, in 1978, it got turned into a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. So it's one of the major sites around the world. And so it's a confirmed fact that there were Norse settlements in Newfoundland, which is, just north of us in Canada, in 1000 AD. So, almost 500 years before Columbus appeared. But yet our textbooks will still tell us that Columbus discovered America, So here's a picture of the settlement. These are sod roofs, over a wooden frame. It's still there today. You can go see it. This is the lady that discovered it in 1963. So here's another one. So in about between 1200 and 1400 AD, they found that the Polynesians had contact with South America. Now, I'm not talking about, this is not Book of Mormon stuff. This is just showing that people did travel before Columbus. I got this information off of a peer-reviewed paper by this guy. It's dated in 2021. It's a fairly new discovery, or new paper, but they found that their sweet potato, they did a DNA research on this, and they found that the sweet potatoes that were found in the Pacific Islands have their roots from sweet potatoes from the Americas, from South America and a little bit of Central America. And so, and we know that it goes way back, because when Captain Cook arrived on the Pacific Islands in 1769, he actually noted that there were sweet potatoes there. And so, this is very old. And when they looked at them, they found that they're actually from the Americas, and they date well back before Columbus. And so they also found that there were chickens in Chile that came from Polynesia. So you had an exchange. So, the Polynesians brought over chickens, and those spread all throughout Chile. They date to 1300 AD. They found it in this little bone you see there is from a chicken that was dated to 1300. They found it in Chile in 2007. And so you had these two cultures exchanging. I mean, they were in trade with one another. And so, I mean, that's well before Columbus as well. And then, of course, we've talked about the Bat Creek Stone before, found in 1889. It was dug up by the Smithsonian Institute during one of their digs in some of the mounds in Tennessee. When they found it, they were excited. They saw this writing on it, said, "Hey, that's Paleo Cherokee." So they take it, they display it in their museum. And then, like in the middle 1900s, I think it was 1960 or 70, these two guys, these Hebrew experts, were at the museum and said, "Wait a minute, that's not Cherokee. If you turn that over, that is Paleo Hebrew." And so, of course, immediately it's a fraud now, because you can't have Hebrew writing in the Americas dating back before Columbus came. And so they said, "Oh, it's a fraud," and so they've debunked it, even though everything points to the fact that it's not a fraud. But if you already believe it, then you're gonna deny it, and that gives you kind of some scale how big it is. And then another thing that's kind of interesting is the shared beliefs. So if the isolationist doctrine was true, and two cultures grew up, or grew over time with no contact with one another, then why are there so many things that are shared between these cultures? And so I show that here. So the creation story. So the Greek, they believe Prometheus, one of their gods, shaped humans out of clay. Mesopotamian humans were molded from clay mixed with divine essence. The Bible, of course, tells us that God handmade man from the dust. So that's old world. And then in the New World, the Mayans believed that humans were first made of mud, then wood, and then corn dough. It's kind of funny. They made them tortillas. We're all just a bunch of tortillas. And then the Cherokee believed that the humans were created from clay by a divine being. So these Cherokee, these Native American tribes, whether it be Maya from Central America or Cherokee from the North America, from America, they all have this belief that we're all made from clay. So where did that come from? If they didn't travel, if there's no connection, then where did the stories come from? And you could say, well, that's just a coincidence, but there's just too many of these for it to be a coincidence. Here's another one, the flood. So Noah's Ark, of course, we know the story. God sends a flood, cleanses the earth. The Maya believe that God sent a flood to destroy flawed humans. The Hopi Indians, they believe that, I don't know who the Spider Woman is, but they believe the Spider Woman saved people from a world-destroying flood. And then we have God's troublemaker. It's kind of this sort of Satan-like character. You've got the Bible. It says Satan rebelled against God and he torments man. Loki is a trickster who disrupts the divine order, much kind of like a Satan character. The Maya, they have a belief. They call them the hero twins. They believe they defeat God through trickery and cunning. And then the Plains tribes, they believe the coyote is a trickster who reshapes the world through trickery and mischief. And so it's very similar beliefs. And I'm being very broad in general, but if you get into the details of a lot of these, they're really, really close stories. And how would Plains Indians have this belief about Satan and they tie it to a coyote? I mean, a lot of the Native American stuff is tied to animals, but the base story comes from the truth that was taught them centuries ago. Worshiping of the sun. So the Egyptian Ra, they believe he sails across the sky daily and battles evil at night. The Incas, they had the sun god that was central to, they believe the sun god is central to cosmic balance. And the Navajo, they believe the sun, which is a divine force, it must be guided to ensure balance. So the Great Spirit guides the sun each day and keeps everything in balance. And then you've got the underworld or hell. The Greeks believe that Orpheus visits the underworld and he retrieved Eurydice. The Bible, of course, says that Jesus visited the souls in hell. The Maya believe these hero twins descended into Xibalba, which is the underworld. They undergo trials and they return victorious. And so you see these same themes through their legends and stories running through all parts of the North and South America. The solstice observations is really interesting. So the Chaco Canyon, the Puebloans of New Mexico, they created the sun dagger, which is a petroglyph that marks the summer solstice when the sunlight, when it goes over, it passes through these rock slabs and the light shines on the dagger on the first day of the summer solstice. The Mayan temples at Tikal and Chichen Itza, they align with the solstice and the equinox sunrises. And it's interesting, at Chichen Itza, there's this serpent carving that when the shadow hits the stairs or whatever, it creates this serpent shape. And at equinox, it actually goes down like it's serpent moving down the side of the temple. And as I saw, built into their culture. And then the Egyptian temples on the other side of the world at Karnak and Abu Simbel, they align with solar events also, marking the seasonal cycles. And so you've got two cultures building temples, Egyptian temples, which are actually pyramids on both sides of the world, and aligning them with equinoxes and solstices. But if they had never had any contact, why would they do all this stuff the same way? And then the Norse, they had the Yule, which is the winter solstice festivals. And then the New Grange of Ireland, the passage tomb, it gets illuminated by the rising sun during the winter solstice. So it's aligned with that as well. So all around the world, these same approach to the heavens. And then another interesting thing is these hinges. So they're also aligned with the solstices. But in England, you've got Stonehenge, which we've all heard of that, is built to align with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. It's in Britain, dates back to about 2500 BC. And then you've got in Illinois, the Mississippian culture, they built the Cahokia Mounds. They have a thing called wood hinge. So they found a big circle of timber posts. And when they did the calculations on it, they found that the posts aligned perfectly. And it's like a giant sundial. So, of course, the trees are gone, but where the post holes were for these trees, when they were built, like you see in the picture there, they would have created shadows, kind of like a big sundial, and it was all centered around measuring the solstice and the sunsets and sunrises. There's actually more of these type of Stonehenge type things. There's another one up in, I think it's in Maryland. There's some other ones too, but I just wanted to show a couple highlights. And then of course we've got these pyramids built, across the world, supposedly never coming in contact, but yet, building the same kind of structures. That's the Great Pyramid of Giza on the right, and its size is calculated as 2 pi times the height, and that equals the perimeter of the base. And the one down in Teotihuacan, in Central America and Mexico, is 4 pi times the height, which equals the perimeter of the base. So even their mathematics are very similar. So this, I don't know if you guys saw my class last week, but this, do you know where would you think this was from, China or Mexico, based on what it looks like?
I'd say China.
Based on I saw your class. You would say China just based on the eyes, I think.
Yeah, it looks very maybe Mongolian or China. This was actually in Mexico. It's an Olmec face, and so a lot of people believe the Chinese traveled around the world, including the Americas. Of course, a lot of people say that the Jaredites were the Olmec, and it's all debatable. But I think the point is that people did travel, and so Columbus was not the first one to come here. He was probably the first one to usher in, kind of the big change where Europe began to really flood over to this land. The Spaniards into Central and South America, and then the French and Spanish, and also the English to America. But here's an interesting one. This was just recently found in 2018. It was kept a secret until 2025 because they wanted to study it before they announced it. But there's a tree. This is in Canada. It's in a real remote region in Canada on the eastern side. And this tree had fallen over during a storm, and it pulled away all the soil, roughly a foot of soil off of the bedrock. And this carving that you see is actually in the bedrock of the soil, it's actually carved into the bedrock. And what it is these are Norse, it's called Elder Futhark or Futhark. It's in Wawa, Canada. And it is, Elder Futhark is the original language of like the Norse, the Germanians tribes of Northern Europe. There's a modern Futhark, but this was actually written in the old original Futhark. That's actually, was a dead language. It was used from 150 AD to about 700 AD by the Germanic tribes. And they found this in Canada. Now it did get, to be fair, it did get a rejuvenation in like the late, I think it was the late 1800s, early 1800s. And so they did figure out how to read it again. And so it is alive again. But this was carved, this was under a big growth tree with lots and lots of soil deep into the heart of Canada. Wouldn't have been someplace anybody in the 1900s would have gone. And these were deeply carved in the stone. So it would have been very difficult to carve all this. And what's interesting is when they interpreted this, they found out that it's a full rendition of the Lord's Prayer. And also along with this, there's like a ship, and there's some X's they think maybe represents the passengers that maybe died in the journey. They're not really sure. But this is, fairly new. They just announced this, I think, in June of this year. So it's a fairly new discovery, probably still going to be some more research. And then this is an interesting one. This lady was found in Peru, along with about 100 other mummified bodies. This dates back to before the time of Columbus. And what's interesting is she had red hair, red curly hair, and red hair it only appears in about 1 to 2% of the world's population. So for her to be, and the natives of South America, don't have red hair. And so they believe that, she may have traveled over somehow, probably in around between 5 to 700 AD, and then was mummified. She was wrapped up in, some people say, well, maybe it was later than that. She was European, maybe she came over in the 1700s, but that's really stretching it, because the way she was mummified was unique. The stuff she was wrapped in, like the blankets and stuff that were, with her, were very, very much traditional local stuff. It wasn't related to Europe in any way. So nothing about her screamed out that this is a lady from, a European lady from the 1700s or something. This is far more ancient. And then this is when I just found this. This one's kind of an interesting one. So there's a place here in Texas. It's a town. It's called Rockwall, Texas. And some farmers back in 1854 were digging in their field, just, I don't know, planting crops or whatever they were doing. And they hit this really solid rock. And they're like, well, what's this? So they start digging around, and it looks like it's got like formed shape to it. So rather than just ignore it as a rock, because this soil here in Texas is, of course, real Rockies, but they decided to dig down around it. So they started digging down around it, and they found that it was stacked stones, and it went down further than they could dig. And so they started doing research, and they actually formed a town right here, and they called the town Rockwall based on this rock wall. But what's interesting is the size of this thing. It is 19 square miles big. That the picture on the right shows where it is. And not only that, but the entire wall is buried. So the top of the wall is under the ground level, and it goes down into the ground 7 stories. So at some point in the past, there was a walled in area 7 stories down. It looks like it's man-made. Now the archaeologists are like, oh no, that's natural, and all that. But when you see the pictures, you can see that the stones are very much stacked upon one another. And keep in mind, this goes down 7 stories, and runs this gigantic length of this 19 square miles. Here's another picture. They took some of the rocks off of it over the years. They used to use it for construction in the town. On the town square, a couple of the buildings still have the rock wall showing where they've taken the stones directly from this rock wall and used it for their construction. So the rocks are very much formed into blocks that you could use to build with. Here's another shot. And so archaeologists, they debunk it. They say, no, this is just natural. These stuff just laid down naturally, which I find it a little silly, but maybe so. But to form in a perfect square. Oh, and the other thing is it lines up with the summer solstice as well. So anyway, we have no idea when this was built, who built it, or and it could possibly be natural. I mean, if we're wrong, but there's a lot of details that point to it being a man-made structure.
That's summer solstice. I mean, the fact it lines up with the summer solstice, and having done some masonry work early on in my life, the way these are stacked is similar. It looks like there's layers of mud even in between, each strata of the stones. I'm just seeing this for the first time. It's crazy. 19 square miles.
19 square miles. Yeah, and seven stories down.
Yeah.
I mean, this could have been built pre-flood, and the whole thing was buried in the flood, or maybe during the time of the destruction of this land.
That's what I was.
That's what I was thinking. The land was changed.
Right, cities were sunken. Others were raised up.
Yeah,
crazy.
Yep. So these are just some kind of tantalizing details. It's kind of funny because when we find things like this, like for example, one of the stories is, it was built by giants, that built this gigantic 7-story wall. Another thing people say, oh, well, aliens, it's an ancient alien structure from the past, because they just can't fathom the idea that any culture from, ancient times was smart enough and strong enough to build something like this, and so it's got to be some other thing. And I guess as an example, when you go in with a preconceived belief about something, it's really hard to shake it and say, well, maybe I'm wrong, So anyway, so this isolationist doctrine has actually begun to shift. So believe it or not, the scientists are finally having to admit that, okay, maybe Columbus wasn't the first one here. That finding in Newfoundland. There's some other things too. So these are modern quotes from people today. So William Fitzhugh, the Smithsonian, he's a Smithsonian archaeologist. He said the Norse site at Lanza Meadow is unequivocal proof that Europeans reached North America around the year 1000, centuries before Columbus. Scientists in the late 1800s would not be caught dead making a statement like this. But the proof is there. They can't deny it. So this one, the notion that Americans were hermetically sealed off from until Columbus is untenable. Botanical, linguistic, and archaeological evidence points to sporadic but real pre-Columbian contacts. Despite limited factual evidence, trans-Pacific contact theories remain a persistent trope, and the accumulation of botanical and linguistic data makes complete isolation increasingly implausible. To learn about the indigenous peoples of the Americas, scholars drew on rare texts and artifacts. These reveal that native cultures were dynamic, interconnected, and far from isolated even before European arrival. And so this is a complete turnaround from the previous approach to this. Now, none of these comments are pro Book of Mormon necessarily, but they're at least now admitting that, people did come here, people did travel. These cultures that could build these amazing structures where you can't even put a piece of paper between the stones of a wall they build, and stones that are many tons in size, and they're carrying them from 800 miles away to build this structure. These people that could do these sort of things and calculate astronomical, celestial events, that kind of thing. How could they not put together some wood and build a boat? I mean, that's just so silly. But because it was so locked in our textbooks from childhood, we just can't see it any other way. So that kind of brings us to the Book of Mormon, and I wanted to just kind of share one kind of tidbit that's kind of interesting. So this is out of the Book of Mosiah. It says, "For having been taught in the language of the Egyptians, therefore he could read these engravings and teach them to his children." So the video here is King Benjamin, and he's teaching his children, how to read the plates, the brass plates, and also how to read the readings of the writings of Lehi, Nephi, and all them, the prophets, previous prophets. And the reason I included this is I wanted to show that, the language of this was written in the language of the Egyptians, and they taught that language to their children. So and this is in 124 AD or BC. So, I mean, this is, 450, 500 years after they left Jerusalem, so, I mean, they're still teaching their children Egyptian, how to write in Egyptian and how to speak the original language of Hebrew. They're still doing that clear up until, just short before the time of Christ. And so, and he says, "I say unto you, my sons, were it not for these things which have been kept and preserved by the hand of God, that we might read and understand of his mysteries and have his commandments always before our eyes, that even our fathers would have dwindled in unbelief." So he's basically saying these people that have gone before us, Lehi, Nephi, and all these guys that we hold up as heroes, if they would not have had these records, the brass plates, they would have dwindled in unbelief and they would have fallen away as well. And so this ability to read and write in this Egyptian and be able to keep these records alive and teaching to their children was huge. And it's what saved the Nephites, or at least what kept them, somewhat in the right path until they finally were wiped out. So that brings me to the Micmac tribe. So if you think about it, so you've got Egyptian, and it's being taught to these people's children, generation after generation, from 600 BC all the way up to 124 BC at least. You would think that some of that would carry over into modern times. Now, granted, the Nephites were the ones that had that knowledge. The Lamanites didn't ever have the brass plates. They didn't. As soon as they came over and they split off, they had no records. So they completely relied on word of mouth and tradition. And of course, they hated their father and brother, so they weren't going to speak any truth to their children. So all their stuff turned into stuff about animals and sunsets and worshiping the sun, and it turned into what basically we have today with the Native American legends. But there still would have been some bleed over because the people intermingled. They had times where they were righteous, times where they were wicked. I mean, they had some interaction. And so if you look at modern, languages today, there should be some bleed over. And I think we have some evidence of that in the Micmac tribe. So the Micmacs, their home was up in the Quebec area, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, in the north, and part of Maine as well. We don't hear a lot about them because, they weren't part of the Plains Indians, they weren't part of like the Cherokee or the Navajo or the ones that we hear the most about. But they were up in Canada. And so they're one of the few, and there's just to show you where Palmyra is in relation to where the Micmac tribe lived. But they're one of the few Native American groups that kept their language alive. They still wrote in these sort of hieroglyphic type writing, even clear up into the modern time. And that's what I wanted to show you today. So here's some facts about the Micmacs. So Micmac, the word, it means the allies or the friends. Their territory covers, and I already told you that, it covers all the way down to Maine. They are the first recorded indigenous tribe to contact Europeans. So when the Norse, when the Vikings came over, they're that first group that they came in contact with. So they met them in 1000 AD. Basque fishermen recorded having met a tribe of Indians as they were fishing off the coast, off the coast of Greenland in 1372. Prince Henry Sinclair wrote in his journal that he came across this native tribe in 1398. Bristol fishermen, they would come over from Sweden and Norway and those northern, Nordic countries, and they would fish. They'd go up through Iceland and come down the coast of Greenland and down into the kind of the Newfoundland area, and they did a lot of fishing. And sometimes they wouldn't even come on land. They just come over here, fish, fill their boats up, and head back, and just salt the fish right there on the boat. Later on, they did actually, come on land sometimes. They figured out they had some advantages to that, but their main focus was the fishing. Then Giovanni Caboto, 1497, recorded having seen this tribe of Native Americans. Gaspar de Corte Real in 1500. Yeah, so these are all like out of their journals and stuff. This is not just hearsay or conjecture. I mean, this is documented facts. The Micmac tribe, they never surrendered their sovereignty, so they still remain a nation today. There's about 25,000 of them. They live on and off reservations in Canada and in the northern part of the United States. So the writing the writing is what I wanted to bring up mostly about the Micmac. So in 1652, there was a Jesuit missionary, kind of a Catholic missionary, that he saw the Micmac writing notes on birch bark. So he's preaching to this group of natives. He's learning their language, trying to speak to them in their language, and he notices that they're taking notes. And he looks on these birch bark things that they are holding, and kind of like a notepad, and they're writing notes while he's speaking. So he first kind of recognizes, hey, they have a language. Then in 1677, Father Christian Leclerc was a Frenchman who was also a missionary. He wrote in his journal that children were taking notes using charcoal, writing on birch bark as he taught them. Then in 1738, Pierre Maillard, who's a French missionary, he learned how to read and write with the Micmac symbol. So he could actually write the symbols, and he actually created a grammar book of the language. And here's his translation of the Lord's Prayer. You can see it's it's kind of hard to read in terms of my image is not great, but anyway, it does go through the whole Lord's Prayer. And then you've got here's some more examples. You got 1791, John Thompson, who was of the HMS Fly. He collected copies of the Lord's Prayer. The people that had written down these copies on birch bark, he collected those, took them back to Europe, and gave them to the Royal Society of London. And they're now in the British Museum. Now they don't put them on display. A lot of documents don't get displayed, but they are in their archive in their collection. Then 1856, Father Eugene Vetramile published the Indian Good Book, and it was a book of prayers and catechisms. It's actually written in the Abenaki language, which is an early Algonquin language, kind of like Micmac. The Abenaki didn't use the same kind of they didn't use characters. They didn't really have a writing style, but their spoken language was very much the same as Micmac, all part of the Algonquins. So the Algonquins were like the Abenaki, the Micmacs, the Iroquois. I think there's like 7 or 8 different groups that fall under the Algonquin language group. And what's interesting is, so if this book's online, it's from 1856. You can actually pull it up and read it. It's translated into English. And I found this really cool. So he had like a thing of rules, like how to read this book. And he says, the language of the Abenakis has a similarity to the Hebrew in the construction and formation of words, in the uses of prefixes and affixes. The sound of the Indian words could, with great propriety, be expressed by the Hebrew alphabet, which I thought was fascinating because, remember, they wrote in Egyptian, but they spoke Hebrew. And so that's how he noticed that it had a Hebrew nature in the way that it was expressed. Now, of course, they wouldn't have had perfect Hebrew in 1856. That their language was over time got changed, obviously through time. I mean, just look at our English language. If you try to read a book from Old English, even from 250 years ago, you can hardly read it. And so the same thing happened. Their language would have had all kinds of new slangs, and it would have changed over time. But it had that same basic style and structure as Hebrew. And then you got the Micmacs and their writing. So they've done a bunch of studies, and they found that the Micmac language is very, very similar to Egyptian. It's so similar that Egyptologists acknowledge that it has the appearance of Egyptian in many ways. Many characters are compatible. However, in the way that science debunks it is they say, well, yeah, that it is Egyptian characters, but it was taught to them by the priests in the 16 and 1700s when they came in contact. They used the Egyptian to make it easier for them to write because they were barbaric and they couldn't learn Latin or French, which is insulting and kind of ridiculous because the Egyptian language was not translated into any kind of readable form until the middle 1800s. So to think that a priest, a Jesuit missionary in 1670 or 18 or 1700 was teaching a dead Egyptian language to a Native American tribe is ridiculous. It's laughable. And so this shows you this is actually out of the Psalms 116, and you can see on the top is the Micmac symbol, and on the bottom is the Egyptian. Let me get my laser pointer here. Okay. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. So there we go. So this is Egyptian for God, this is Micmac for God or the exalted one. This is the same in Egyptian. It uses a pyramid. Here you've got heaven, incorporates a star. His dwelling is kind of shaped like a building. You look at these characters, and there's a lot, and they're not exactly the same, but they wouldn't be because if the Micmac brought their characters, from being taught that back in the time of Christ, the Egyptian over time it would have it would have altered. Things would have kind of shifted and changed, and it would have been their own 2,000 or a 1,800-year-old version of Micmac, of Egyptian. So it would have changed. But you can see so many of these things are similar. The idols, right here, the word by, it really, there's a lot that does correlate. And so much so that Egyptologists even acknowledge it, but they just make an excuse that, they were taught that later. All right. And then, so here's just a few more of their spiritual words. So you've got the word goodness, beauty, and truth in Egyptian, and the letters for holy in Micmac, heaven, and a couple of these are on that other slide. And then I thought this is really cool. So this is the last slide I have, but so the word for God in Micmac is this triangle. And then God the Father is the triangle with this symbol. God the Son is this other one, and then the Holy Spirit. So you see that God is all of these. It's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And so God is in all of it, which coincides with, with our understanding from the Book of Mormon that, God took upon himself flesh, and he's called the Son, but it's still God. Same with the Holy Spirit, same with the Father. And so even built into their language, they have that understanding that we find in the Book of Mormon. So that's all I had, Mike.
Oh, this is really cool right here, incorporating all three into God. So takeaways from this, like you said, this isn't really meant to support the Book of Mormon, but in a roundabout way it does, because it shows the idea people were traveling. There was more intermingling. It's, this idea of building boats and setting out on the sea isn't unique to the Book of Mormon, but other groups being here. I recently saw a podcast with Joe Rogan, had a guy on that archaeologist type guy, and they were showing LiDAR scans of Central South America and just these huge cities and highways and byways that are buried under the jungle that can now be seen, to show that, there was huge populations on this continent well before Columbus, back into the hundreds after Christ, the years, and probably going back farther. So just it's interesting, like that little thing in Canada just happened to pop up. You wonder about how God's slowly revealing these things, in time. Mm-hmm. And then you made a mention, Shane, about the people that are responsible for the archaeology and research. A lot of these things aren't on display, and you wonder what else has been found that's been hidden away somewhere in the museums or the under the Vatican, or that really would misshape or turn around the history that we've been taught for their own sinful purposes, I guess. Why would you hide that, but other than to make your own narrative?
Yeah, it's I think we'd be shocked to find out how many things are locked away in museum vaults that that prove things that we know to be true, but they're hiding it because it doesn't go with the narrative,
Right. Well, that's fascinating.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, go ahead, Mark.
No, I was just going to say the Smithsonian had a whole doctrine called Manifest Destiny, which was purely to be able to justify what they did to the American Indians, to take their land, to say they were savages, to say we've got to bring them to a higher plane. And literally thousands upon thousands of Indian mounds that were just plowed under and destroyed. I've got to believe the vast majority of evidence has just been destroyed, not kept in the archives, because they needed that to do what they wanted to do with this land.
Yeah. There's been, I read somewhere that there's like people that have buckets and buckets of these, like the Michigan artifacts, like, in their basements and their attics and stuff, that they're being told when they go and take it to a college to look at, they say, oh, that's not real. That's fake. but they're basing that on the fact that, it would have had to have been here before Columbus. So that's impossible, or these people had a written language. Well, we know they didn't because they were savages, so stuff gets put into the bucket of fraud. And so people just go home, with their stuff and stick it back in the attic. And I guess it's fake,
Well, I
it's
noticed
kind
the
of sad.
first quote. Sorry. The first quote you did on the guy up in Canada about the Norse stuff 1,000 years. It said he was a Smithsonian archaeologist. And so I don't know how he still got a job there, and how you
Yeah.
can square that with the manifest destiny. And I mean, are they ever going to be able to come out and say, okay, we were wrong? Yeah, because the two don't fit together.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you, Shane. That's a very interesting things. That lady with the red hair, the way they mummified him, just the pi. The idea of, I don't even know what pi is, other than it's a number in math that's used for a bunch of things. But man, those pyramids with the same scale on both sides, and crazy.
Well, and everything lined up to the summer solstices and all that. I mean,
yeah.
I get, the thing is, you think about it, you think, well, I don't know, we kind of blow things off. But like, Mike, if I was to come to your house and say, hey, Mike, let's build a shed in your backyard, let's line it up with the summer solstice, would you know how to do that?
No.
I mean, I wouldn't either, and so you see all these things, and they found all kinds of incredible stuff. Like they found bodies in the Mayan. The Mayan culture was very advanced, and they found skulls with parts cut out of the skull, and then the skull had begun to grow back together. So they actually did some sort of a surgery on the person, and the person lived because the skull began to, it had growth growing back, closing back up again. And there's so many things like that. Here in America, I mean, you've got whole highways, and these mounds are just massive projects, and they line up perfectly with solar stuff, astronomical stuff. And it's like, how would they know to do that? I mean, I wouldn't know how to do that. Even using a computer, I probably couldn't. I don't know if I could figure it out or not. But yeah, we love to just say that, oh, the ancient people, we are the ones that are advanced. We've been to the moon. We have supercomputers and AI. But I really think that our level of intelligence is only comparable to our walk with God. And so, we're told in the scriptures that man's wisdom is foolishness to God. And so you look at these ancient cultures and you say, okay, how did these people get this advanced? And I think it's probably because they were in a period of righteousness. They learned how to do all this stuff, but then they began to dwindle in unbelief, ripen in iniquity, and then get wiped out. And all the only thing that lasted was the stone structures they made. I mean, the crafts that we make and all that are all going to be disappeared 1,000 years from now. Nothing we make is going to be here except for the stuff we made out of rock. But it's so arrogant and prideful for us to say, that we are the most advanced ever. That's just silly, especially when we can't explain how a lot of these things were built, like the pyramids, for example.
Well, and we're so far segmented and removed from, like back then, you had to have some knowledge of how to do certain things to even survive, whether it's make a tomahawk or, make some type of crude or farming instrument out of metal. If you didn't know that, you wouldn't survive. But look at our society today. It wouldn't take much for a few factories to collapse into the ground or be destroyed by earthquake. A handful of people that were killed in war that had the knowledge of AI and how to program these things. They're so far removed from me, going to work every day and following the stoplights and doing my little life and the laws. But you've got these higher ups so removed that have made this technology. I mean, you could see where we could be sent back into barbaric times, probably with a war or certain people with knowledge dying. You know what I mean? Like we could have a great reset and be AI and everything gone because no one knows how to, the people that have been involved, there's such a smaller group and so far removed from us just doing our basic jobs every day that, we could easily go backwards, if that makes sense. I don't know if that made sense or not, but
Well, yeah, I mean, it does make sense. We rely on digital stuff so much, like how do you have proof that you own your house? How do you have proof that you have money in the bank? It's digital. It's all, you might have a deed, a paper, but what if they say, well, that's not true. That's fraud. You just made that up. I mean, they could strip you of everything. You could say, no, your bank account shows zero. You don't have any money. You don't have any retirement. Your 401k, there is no such thing. And you could get gaslit into thinking that you have nothing. The whole society could easily collapse overnight.
Right.
With that kind of deception. Yeah.
Survival of the fittest then, right? Just like it was back in the crusade, whoever wins and takes the property, it's their property.
Yeah, exactly.
I think if we just lost electricity, our society would collapse. I mean, so many things are tied to that. All the digital, all the AI. And, just our heat in our house and everything else. And the well, if you're out in the country like me that pumps your water, I mean, without electricity, this society would fall apart overnight.
Well, even just like what we do on this podcast with research, when you think about how much Google searches and our restored gospel website searches we do, AI. I mean, if all that was gone and all we had was these old books, to look through, I mean, it would really slow us down in terms of how quickly we could put something together.
Yeah. And we wouldn't be broadcasting it to anybody. So
no, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. So it seems that, it's easy to fall into this idea that we are intelligently superior, from other races or groups or periods in time, but to recognize that certainly these societies have been here for whatever, like you said, Shane, they fall into sin, they war, they kill. And, it's this cycle, right? There's not those, I mean, these highways that are being found underneath layers and layers of things with new radar technology, civilizations that were incredible. Yeah. And probably in some ways, better technology than we have today. People still wonder, how did Stonehenge and how did the pyramids with these giant heavy blocks be, how were they built by people without, so-called without, excavators and big machines running on diesel, right? And cranes that are 20 stories up to move things. You have no idea still.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, these are the fun things to at least realize that we have to reshape and rethink and cling to truth and things we're sometimes told. And, this world's a lot bigger than we understand. It just is. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and I think this highlights the importance of having a relationship with God and trusting, what he said in his scriptures, and not relying on man and man's wisdom, because it's so easy to debunk everything important in your life and, by man's fraudulent ideas, and then throwing God out the window, and we just dwindling in unbelief. I mean, that's we see that cycle over and over and over throughout history with pretty much every society, including us Gentiles, where you see this dwindling in our society of morality. It just highlights the need to come back to God and have a walk with him, And
the thought that through all of these civilizations and things that only a certain group of people in a certain time period recorded the word of God, and that's all there is, and we don't accept anything else, to me is also just a man-made construct, and it turns you off from what the bigger picture is that God has in store for all his creation, and we see that in just a small way with the Book of Mormon versus the Bible. But, I imagine other records are going to come forth, and we've all been primed to, these 66 books and nothing else is, from God. And I think that's a dangerous road and just a losing type of road to go down, to think in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a great question too for the Bible only people is, well, since you're only going to rely upon the Bible, show me where it says you can only rely upon the Bible and the Bible in it. It really doesn't do that. So that whole construct is just, it kind of pulled out of thin air that, well, you know, God inspired holy men to put this together and that's it. But the Bible doesn't say that.
Well, I'll take us out. We're just walking each other home. Be kind to one another. Shane, thank you.
Yeah,
Until
beautiful.
next time, God bless.
All right. See you guys.